The seal cracked under her thumb before she had quite decided to break it, a small, dry sound in the cold morning, and Beatrice Vane stood very still in the corridor outside the South Library and listened to the wax fall in 2 pieces against the floor. She did not pick them up. Through the half-open door she could see the writing desk that had been hers for 3 winters, and seated at it, in pale blue and pearl, was a woman who had never set foot in Hartcombe until this hour, turning over the ledger Beatrice had ruled by hand the previous Tuesday. The survey she had come to deliver was still in her palm, the cracked seal cooling against her skin, and somewhere behind her, deeper in the house, the long case clock she had paid the cooper's wife to mend struck the 3/4 hour, and Beatrice understood, without anyone needing to say it, that she had walked into the end of something rather than the beginning. She did not move at once. Movement, she had learned, was what people watched for. Stillness gave a person time to think, and she needed the time. The corridor smelled faintly of beeswax and damp stone, and the cut chrysanthemums that the housekeeper put out only when guests were expected. She had not been told there would be guests. The fire in the library had been lit early. The curtains were tied back with the green cords that were used in summer, which meant someone had instructed Mrs. Bream to make the room handsome, and Mrs. Bream, who answered to Beatrice on every other matter of housekeeping, had not thought to send word. That, more than the cousin by courtesy at the desk, told her where she now stood in the house. Lady Sabine Verrill was lifting a page to the light. She had a way of holding paper, between fingertips only, as if she did not quite trust the ink not to come off on her. The page was the spring rents tally from the West tenants. Beatrice had drafted it 3 times, because the Latham Widows column had to be rounded down, and then accounted back in another quarter, so the woman could keep her cow without anyone above stairs noticing. The shape of that small kindness was now turning over in a stranger's hand. A step on the boards behind her. She did not turn. "You came in by the kitchen door." "I came in by the door I always use." Adrian Thorne moved past her into the library without offering her his arm. He had dressed for the occasion, the dark coat, the better cravat, the boots that had been blacked twice. He stopped a careful 3 paces from the desk, as a host stops before a guest he wishes to flatter, and Lady Sabine looked up at him with the slow, pleased smile of a woman who has been told a room is hers and is choosing to believe it. Beatrice. He had to turn to address her, and the turning was an effort, she saw that. "I had hoped to speak with you before you came up." "You sent for me at 9. "I sent for you at 10. She did not argue the hour. There was a note in her dressing-room drawer that said 9. She let it lie there in the drawer where it would be useful later, and she stepped just inside the threshold so that the conversation could not be conducted at her back. He gathered himself. She watched him gather himself. He had a particular small gesture for it, a flexing of the left hand at his side, as if testing whether the fingers still worked, and she had first noticed it at their wedding breakfast, and had taken it then for nerves of affection. She knew better now. It was the gesture of a man preparing to say something he had not entirely written. "Lady Sabine will be taking over the management of the household, and of the estate office. It is more proper. It has always been more proper. A steward's daughter was never meant to hold what she'd been minding." He had rehearsed the last sentence. The cadence gave him away. The slight pause before minding was the pause of a man who had tried it 3 ways in the glass. Lady Sabine, at the desk, did not lower the page. She let it sit between her fingertips and watched Beatrice over the top edge with mild, courteous curiosity, as one watches a horse one has not yet decided to ride. Beatrice considered the room, the fire, the chrysanthemums, the cords, the ledger open at the spring rents, the inkwell, which was hers, and which someone had moved 2 inches to the left to make space for a fresh pen tray, the survey in her hand, the seal of which she had cracked herself half a minute ago without meaning to. She crossed to the desk. Lady Sabine did not rise. Beatrice had not expected her to. She set the survey down on the corner of the blotter, neither close to Sabine nor far from her, in the exact place where a document goes when its bearer is not certain whether it will be read. Then she changed her mind. She picked the survey up again. Beatrice. She did not look at him. She tucked the survey into the inner pocket of her traveling cloak, where the lining was double-stitched against rain, and she walked past him to the door. He took half a step as if to put a hand on her sleeve, and then did not. The half-step she would remember. She closed the door behind her with the latch held so that it did not click, because Mrs. Bream had told her once, in the first month of her marriage, that a lady never lets a door announce her. In the corridor she stood again for a moment. The 2 pieces of broken seal were still on the floor by her foot. She bent and picked them up, and put them in her glove. Then she walked, neither quickly nor slowly, toward the back stairs, and behind her in the library Adrian Thorne stood in the warm light of a fire someone else had ordered, and felt, without yet knowing why, that the room had grown an inch larger in every direction, and that he was now standing in the middle of it, alone. She did not weep on the back stairs. She had not wept on stairs since she was 7 years old, and her father had told her, kindly, that weeping on stairs was a waste of a good descent. She used the descent instead to count 3 years of rents, 11 disputed boundaries, of which she had settled 9 in his favor, and 2 in the favor of justice. 42 tenants whose names she could write in order of their cottages along the lane from the gatehouse to the chapel. 1 survey, folded against her ribs, that she had drawn herself by lantern in the estate office on 6 nights of the previous October, while Adrian was at Newmarket on borrowed money, and which proved a thing that no Thorne had ever wished to know. At the bottom of the stairs, the boot boy, Tom, was polishing a pair of riding boots that did not belong to anyone she recognized. He looked up at her and then quickly down, the way the servants had begun looking at her since yesterday, and she understood that the household had been told before she had. That was not Tom's fault. She paused by him anyway and put her hand briefly on the top of his head, because he had been frightened of her in the first week and was not any more, and she did not want him to be frightened again. Whose boots? Her ladyship's groom, missus. He'll want the left one stretched. There's a seam catching at the heel. Yes, missus. She went on. At the kitchen door she stopped only to take her bonnet from the peg where she had left it an hour ago, when she had still been a wife, coming in from the home farm with mud on her hem. The mud was still there. She did not brush it off. She tied the bonnet under her chin with hands that surprised her by being steady, and she stepped out into a morning that smelled of wood smoke and frost and the river, and behind her, in a room she would not see again, a celebrated lady turned over a ledger she could not read, and a duke began, very slowly, to understand that he had no idea what his own house had cost. The lane to the gatehouse ran between 2 hedges that Beatrice herself had ordered laid 2 winters back, when the hawthorn had grown so high the tenants could not see the post-rider coming, and the bared wood at the cuts was still pale, the new growth still tender. She walked between them at a steady pace. The chrysanthemums were behind her now, and the fire, and the pearl-colored woman at the desk, and the man who had married her for a dowry that had paid off the worst of his Newmarket notes inside the first month, and for a usefulness he had never once examined. None of it was behind her in any final sense, of course. She knew the lane would turn. She knew where it would bring her. She had walked it in her head a great many times. She passed the milestone where the parish ended, and a stranger would not have known the parish had ended, and she went on toward the Dowager's Gate at Linen Cross, where a letter she had written the previous Thursday was, by now, lying on a different desk, waiting to be opened by a different hand. She had not gone to Linen Cross since her wedding. She had no plans this morning to go anywhere else. Behind her, the broken seal lay in her glove and warmed against her palm, and she could feel, without looking, the small, dry edges of it. She thought, "That will do for a token, until I have a better one." Then she thought of nothing for a long while, and the lane took her where it had always been going to take her, and the morning ran on without her having to push it. The Dowager of Linen Cross was named Honoria Brackwell, and she was 81 years old, and she had outlived a husband, 2 sons, a daughter-in-law, a favored spaniel, 3 solicitors, and, by her own count, every man in the county who had ever tried to swindle her. She received Beatrice in a small parlor that smelled of lavender water and pipe tobacco, the tobacco being her own. She did not rise. She gestured at the chair opposite with a hand whose knuckles were the colour of riverstones, and waited until Beatrice had sat before she spoke. "You took your time. I had to wait until he was ready to do it. And he was ready this morning. At 10, by his clock." Honoria Brackwell's eyes were the pale grey of a sky that has not yet decided what to do, and they fixed on Beatrice now without blinking. She had read the letter. The letter was open on the small table beside her, beside a cooling cup of tea and a pair of spectacles she did not need but kept for effect. "You have brought the survey." "Yes." "By whose authority?" "My own. I am the steward's daughter." A small, dry sound came from the old woman's throat that might have been a laugh and might have been the beginning of one. She did not let it become a laugh. She lifted the survey, folded it again with the care of a woman who had folded many important pages in her life, and laid it on the table beside the letter. "Your husband has spent 11 years calling me a relic." "He has." "To my face, twice. I was present for one of them." "You said nothing." "I was learning what he was." Honoria Brackwell looked at her then in a way that Beatrice had not been looked at by anyone since her mother died. It was not pity. It was not affection. It was the look of one practical woman recognizing another across a table, and Beatrice felt, for the first time since the seal had cracked in her hand, something settle in her chest that had been loose for 3 years. "You will want to know what I intend to do. I will want to know what you intend to do for the tenants." "They are not my tenants." "They will be." The old woman regarded her a moment longer. Then she lifted a small bell from the table and rang it once, and a maid she did not introduce came and took away the cooling tea and brought a fresh pot and 2 cups and a plate of plain biscuits that no one touched. When the maid had gone, Honoria Brackwell did not pour. She pushed the pot and the cups toward Beatrice and folded her hands in her lap and waited. "There is a cottage at Stenwick, 2 rooms, a small orchard. The roof was mended last summer. It belongs to me through my mother's people. I should like it kept tenantable for at least one occupant in particular. The Duke." "The Duke." You wish me to settle the Duke in a 2-room cottage with an orchard. I wish him not to be hungry. I wish him not to be cold. I wish him to have a place that is his to sit in. I will see to the annuity through Mr. Mostyn at Norwich. The cottage I should like to be in your gift rather than mine, because he will not take it from me. He will take it from me? He will not refuse the Dowager of Linen Cross. He will be too ashamed. Honoria Brackwell considered this. The pale, grey eyes moved over Beatrice's face with the same patient measure she had given the survey. Then she nodded once, a small, definite nod, and poured the tea. You are not doing this out of love. No. You are not doing it out of revenge. No. What are you doing it out of? Beatrice looked at the survey on the table. The cracked seal in her glove had cooled. She thought of the boot boy on the back stairs. She thought of the Latham widow's cow. She thought of her father, who had been a steward, and had taught her that a steward's first duty was to whatever was under her hand, whether or not it had thanked her for it. Habit. The Dowager set the teapot down. She did not laugh this time either, but the corner of her mouth moved. That is a very dangerous answer. Yes. I like it. They drank the tea. They did not speak again for some minutes. Outside the small parlour, the morning had begun to turn from frost into pale sun, and somewhere in the kitchens beyond the green baize door, a copper pan was being scoured, and the sound of it came through the boards in a low, patient rasp. And Beatrice listened to it, and let her hands rest at last in her lap, and did not think about Hartcombe at all. When she rose to go, Honoria Brackwell did not rise with her. She lifted the survey in 2 fingers, the way Lady Sabine had lifted the ledger, and she looked at Beatrice once more over the fold. You understand what this paper will do. I drew it. It will not destroy him. No. It will leave him a guest in his own house. It will leave him a man who has to ask, for the first time in his life, whether he may sit down. You think that is worse. I think it is accurate. The Dowager smiled, finally, a small, dry smile that did not reach her eyes, and lifted her hand from the survey, and the survey lay between them like a thing that no longer belonged to either of them, and never had. Adrian Thorne stood in the library for a long while after the door had closed. The fire popped once. Lady Sabine turned a page she did not understand. He did not move to her side. He did not move at all. He had expected, when he had imagined the conversation, that Beatrice would cry or argue or ask whether there was no other way, and that he would be put to the small trouble of finding gentle answers. He had not expected her to set a sealed paper on the desk, take it up again, and leave without raising her voice. He found, examining the room from the place he had not moved from, that he did not know what the paper had been. Adrian. He turned. Lady Sabine had laid the ledger down. She was looking at him with an expression he had seen before in drawing rooms, the patient, kind look that polite women use on men who have forgotten the next thing they were meant to say. You did not tell me she would take it like that. I did not know she would take it like that. Is she always so quiet? He thought about it. He thought about it longer than the question deserved, and he saw, with a small shock that did not yet have a shape, that he could not answer. He had known Beatrice Vane for 4 years. He had married her 3 years ago next month. He could not, standing in his own library, say whether his wife was a quiet woman or only a woman who had been quiet with him. She is a steward's daughter. They are taught to make no noise." Lady Sabine considered him. Then she smiled, the same slow, pleased smile, and lifted the ledger again and turned it toward him. "What is this column?" He looked. It was a row of small, careful figures running down the right-hand side of a page headed Spring, West Tenants. The numbers did not match the rents he had named at the magistrate's dinner. They were lower in 3 places, and higher in 1. He could not, looking at them, remember why. "It is the rents. It does not match the rents." "It must match the rents. She kept the rents." "It does not match the rents you told my uncle last Michaelmas." He took the ledger from her. He held it the way Sabine had held it, between fingertips, and he turned the page back and forward and back again, and the figures arranged themselves under his eye in patterns he could not read. He had not, he understood now, ever read them. He had asked her, once a quarter, whether the rents were in, and she had said yes, and he had gone on. The yes had been doing a great deal of work he had not noticed it doing. "It will be in the office. There will be a fair copy in the office." "Then perhaps you should fetch it." He went. The library door, when he closed it, did click. He had not Beatrice's trick of the latch. In the corridor, the chrysanthemum smelled, suddenly, too strong. He passed Mrs. Bream on the back stairs, and Mrs. Bream curtsied without meeting his eye, which was new. He did not stop to ask why. The estate office was a small room at the end of the east passage. He had been inside it perhaps 6 times in 3 years, twice to fetch a hat he had left there during the brief enthusiasm of his engagement, and the other 4 to sign things she had set in front of him. He pushed the door open now and stopped on the threshold. It was in perfect order. He had expected, he discovered, a kind of feminine disorder, papers in piles, a shawl thrown over a chair, the sort of clutter that would have allowed him to say afterwards, "Of course she could not have managed it. Look at the state of it." The room was not in that state. The desk was bare except for an inkwell, a pen rest, and a ledger that lay closed and squared to the corners. The shelves were ranked by year and quarter, each spine labeled in her hand, a small, precise hand he had received notes in for 3 years without ever noticing how good it was. Above the desk was a map of the estate that he did not recognize. He had been over his own land all his life. He did not recognize this map. He went closer. The map was hand-drawn in fine black ink. The southern boundary where his land met the Dowager's at the beck had been drawn twice, once in faint pencil along the line he had always known, and once in firm ink along a line some 30 yards north of it. Between the 2 lines, hatched in grey, lay a long, irregular shape that ran from the chapel coppice to the lower water meadow. In the corner of the hatching, in the same small, precise hand, was written, "Coal, 3 seams confirmed, see survey of October 9th. He stood for some time looking at this map. The fire in the office had not been lit. The room was cold. He felt the cold come up through the boards into his boots and into his knees, and he found that he was holding the edge of the desk to keep his hand from shaking, and he could not have said, if asked, whether it was the cold or something else. He went to the shelves. He found the year. He found the quarter. He took down the ledger and opened it, and the first page was a fair copy in her hand of the spring rents, and the numbers matched the ledger Lady Sabine had been turning over, and they did not match the rents he had named at the magistrate's dinner. He turned a page. He turned another. Letters from tenants, fair copied and answered, the answers in her hand and signed for the Duke of Wexmoor, by his order. He had given no order. He had not known there were letters. He turned a page. A list of disputed boundary claims with the parish, 11 of them, 9 marked settled in our favor, and beside each of the 9 a single dry note in her hand. Evidence questionable, but uncontested. 2 marked settled against, and beside each of the 2, correct under the survey. He closed the ledger. He put it back on the shelf. He stood in the cold office for a long moment, with his hands still on the spine, and the small, dry shock that had not yet had a shape began, slowly, to take one. She had not been minding his house. She had been holding it up. He went back to the library by a longer way than he needed, because he could not yet face the woman at the desk, and when he reached the library door, he stood outside it for a count of 10 before he opened it. Lady Sabine had gone to the window. She turned when he came in. She was smiling still, but a small line had appeared between her brows, and he understood, looking at her, that the line had been there since he had left the room, and that she had been wearing it for him. "Adrian, there is a man at the gate." "What man?" "Mr. Mostyn's clerk. He says he has come from Norwich. He says he has a letter for me." "For you?" "For me." He went to the window. The clerk was standing in the gravel sweep with a leather case under his arm, and he was speaking to the gatekeeper, and the gatekeeper was nodding, and the gatekeeper, Adrian saw, knew the clerk by name. The clerk had come not from Norwich, but from the Norwich office of Mr. Mostyn, who had been the late dowager's solicitor, and had become, 10 months ago, by arrangements that Adrian had not been told of, the solicitor for a certain Mrs. Vane of Stenwick, who held a small but interesting freehold in her own name. The letter he carried was addressed to Lady Sabine Verrill, and contained, in 2 paragraphs of cold, clear English, the information that the southern boundary of the Hartcombe estate had been formally surveyed and recorded, under instruction received from another party, but the recorded boundary differed materially from the boundary under which the present Duke of Wexmoor's father had claimed mineral rights, and that any sale, lease, or assignment of those rights by the present Duke would be contested in Chancery by parties already in possession of the surveyor's affidavit. The letter did not name Beatrice. It did not need to. It was dated the previous Friday. Lady Sabine read it twice. She handed it to Adrian without comment, and went back to the window. He read it once, and then a second time, slowly, because the words did not, on the first reading, attach themselves to anything he knew. When he had read it the second time, he set it on the desk beside the ledger that did not match the rents, and he sat down in the chair Lady Sabine had been sitting in, which was the chair Beatrice had used for 3 years. "You knew," Lady Sabine said. She said it gently. She did not turn from the window. "I did not." "You ought to have." "I ought to have." There was a long silence. The fire shifted. The chrysanthemums in the heated room had begun to smell of decay rather than of flower, and he thought, with sudden vividness, of his wife coming into the library that morning with mud on her hem and a sealed paper in her hand, and of the half-step he had taken toward her and not finished. He thought of the door closing without a click. He thought of the survey she had set on the desk and then taken back, and he understood, finally, what the paper had been. "Where is she?" "She has gone, Adrian." "Where?" "I do not know. I am not the one she would tell." He sat for a while longer. He did not weep, because he had not, since boyhood, been a man who wept, and the habit of not weeping held now, as habits do. He felt instead a kind of widening in the chest, a slow, patient understanding that the room he was sitting in had been built and rebuilt around him for 3 years by a woman whose hand he had held twice at the altar and not since, and that the building of it had been the only conversation she had been able to have with him, and that he had not, in all that time, read a single page. Sabine. Yes. You will not be the mistress of Hartcombe. No. I am sorry to have brought you. She turned from the window. The line between her brows had deepened, but she was not unkind. She had been a celebrated lady for 15 years, and had survived in drawing rooms by reading rooms quickly. She had read this one. I think I shall go and sit in the morning room and write to my uncle. I shall not write that you have been a fool. I shall write that the matter was more complicated than we knew. Will that do? That will do. She went. He sat in his wife's chair in the library that had been arranged for a different woman, and he looked at the letter on the desk, and at the ledger, and at the empty place on the blotter where a sealed survey had briefly been set down and taken up again. And for the first time in his adult life, he understood that he was about to have to ask a great many questions of people who had been answering them for him, unasked, for years. The Stenwick cottage stood at the end of a stone lane that the lane menders had been forgetting for a decade. But the roof had been mended the previous summer because Beatrice had paid for it to be mended, and the orchard at the back had been pruned in March because she had paid for that as well. It had 2 rooms downstairs and 2 above, a parlor with a small grate, a kitchen with a deep sill where a cat had once slept and had been gone for some years, and a stair so narrow that a tall man would learn to duck. She came to it in the early afternoon, on foot from Linen Cross, with the survey in the inner pocket of her cloak and the cracked seal still warming in her glove. She had not, until she stood in the parlor with the door open to the garden, allowed herself to consider that she had nowhere else to go. The thought arrived now, and she sat down with it on the deal chair beside the cold grate, and let it sit beside her, like a guest she had not invited. It was not unpleasant. It was, in a way she had not expected, restful. She had spent 3 years standing where she had not been invited to stand. To sit, even briefly, in a room that was hers in her own name was a sensation she discovered she did not quite know what to do with. She took the survey out of her cloak and laid it on the small table by the window. She took the cracked seal out of her glove and laid the 2 halves beside the survey. She looked at them for a while. Then she took off her bonnet and put it on the peg by the door, and she set water to boil in the kettle that had been left on the hob by whoever had aired the house for her last week. And she went outside to look at the apple trees. There were 9 of them. She had ordered 6 pruned and 3 left, because the 3 were old and were going to come down in the next winter's storm, and there was no point in spending money on them. The 6 that had been pruned had set fruit thinly, but well. She walked along the row and put her hand on each trunk in turn, and made a note in her head about the south-facing one, where the bark had split and would need binding before frost. She had walked along rows of trees with her father since she was 4 years old. The motion of it, the pause at each trunk, the small attention given and moved on from, was the most familiar thing she had done all day. She went back inside when the kettle whistled. She made tea in a brown pot she had bought at the market in Norwich for 7d. She drank it standing at the window because the deal chair was uncomfortable and she had not yet had time to put a cushion on it. And she watched a pair of crows quarrel over something in the lane, and she thought about the figures in the spring rents ledger. The Latham widow's cow would, by Michaelmas, be a matter for the dowager. The boundary at the South Beck would be a matter for the Chancery solicitor and for the surveyor she had hired in Norwich. The disputed claim with the parish at Greal would resolve in the parish's favour when the survey was lodged, and the curate, who was a decent man, would be relieved. The 42 tenants would have, by the spring, a new landlord, who was 81 years old and had no patience and no malice, and they would, on the whole, fare better than they had before, because the old woman would not be ashamed to ask what a cow cost. The one matter that did not resolve in the ledger was Adrian. She set the cup down on the sill. She had known, walking from Linen Cross, that the cottage and the annuity would not, in themselves, settle the matter of Adrian Thorne. She had known it that morning, standing in the corridor with the cracked seal in her hand. She had known it for some months, in fact. The cottage was the form of an answer. It was not the answer itself. The answer she had been working her way toward, as one works through an account, was that Adrian was not a wicked man. He was an unread one. He had been brought up to assume that the world had been written for him, and he had not, in 32 years, troubled himself to learn its hand. He had married her because she had brought £4,000, and because the older men at the club had told him she was a steady creature who would not embarrass him. And he had stopped, on the day of the wedding, considering her at all. He had not been cruel to her. He had simply not seen her. To not be seen by a man one had agreed to live beside was, she had discovered, a more particular wound than to be struck by him. And it had taken her 2 of the 3 years to understand what it was. She was not in love with him. She had been, at the beginning, for perhaps a month. She had mistaken his easy manners for kindness, and his absence for trust. And when she had understood the mistake, she had not, being her father's daughter, allowed herself the indulgence of resentment. She had instead gone to the estate office and begun, page by page, to learn what he owned. By the end of the first year, she had known the estate better than the steward who had been pensioned off for drink. By the end of the second, she had known it better than any Thorne had known it in 3 generations. She had not done it for him. She had done it because the work was in front of her, and the tenants were in front of her, and her father had taught her that work in front of one was to be done. She had hoped, however, that he would one day come and find her at the desk and ask what she was doing. She had hoped this for a long time. It had been a small hope, kept at the back of her mind like a candle stub in a drawer, not lit, but available. She had not allowed it to grow into anything more demanding than that. This morning, when Lady Sabine had been sitting at the desk, the candle stub had quietly gone out, and she had understood, in the corridor with the seal cracking in her hand, that the hoping was over, and that the next part of her life had begun without ceremony. She finished the tea. She rinsed the cup at the pump in the yard. She came back inside and stood for a while in the center of the parlor with her hands at her sides, and she thought, I shall need a cushion for that chair, and a second pot for boiling, and a quire of paper, and a penknife, and a lamp. She wrote the list on the back of an old receipt she found in the drawer of the table, and she did not, while writing, allow herself to think of the library at Hartcombe, or of the man sitting in it. When the list was done, she folded it. She put on her bonnet. She walked down the stone lane toward the village, which was a mile, because she meant to spend an hour at the carpenter's about the south-facing apple tree before she did anything else. The afternoon was bright and cold. The hedges had been laid by someone competent, perhaps 4 winters back, and were growing well. She noted, as she walked, 3 places where the ditch would need clearing before the spring rains, and she noted them without writing them down, because she had always remembered such things, and saw no reason to stop. At the carpenter's she ordered the binding wire and asked after his daughter, who had been ill in the autumn, and was told the girl was well. She paid for the wire from a small purse she had kept for 3 years in the false bottom of her writing case, against a moment she had not been able to name in advance. The purse was lighter when she left the shop than when she had come in, and it pleased her to feel the difference. She had spent her own money on her own work. The sensation was, she thought, what other people meant when they spoke of freedom. On the way back up the lane, she met the parish curate, who was coming down from a visit to a sick farmer, and he raised his hat to her and called her Mrs. Vane, which had been her mother's name, and which was, since this morning, her own. He did not, she noticed, look surprised to be calling her that. The village had known then, before she had. She did not mind. She returned the greeting and walked on, and the cracked seal in her glove had cooled to the temperature of her palm, and was, by now, indistinguishable from her own hand. He came to Stenwick 4 days later. She had known he would. She had not known when. She was kneeling in the garden when she saw him at the gate. She had been tying the south-facing apple with the binding wire, and her hands were dirty, and her hair, which she had not put up properly because there had been no one to put it up for, had come loose at the temple. She did not stand. She finished the knot. She wiped her hands on the apron she had borrowed from a peg in the kitchen, and she rose at her own pace, and she went down the path to the gate. He had ridden alone, which surprised her, and he had ridden without a groom, which surprised her more. He had not dressed for the visit. His coat was the riding coat he kept at Hartcombe for inspecting the home farm, and the cuffs were spotted with mud from the lane, and his hair, under the hat, had not been properly cut for some weeks. He looked older than she had seen him look in 3 years. She did not, when she registered this, feel pity. She did not feel triumph. She felt the small, attentive interest of a person watching a familiar landscape under a different light. Beatrice. Adrian. He did not dismount at once. He sat the horse a moment longer, as if he had rehearsed the dismount in his head on the ride, and had not, even now, decided whether to go through with it. Then he swung down, more heavily than he used to, and he stood with the reins in his hand and looked at her over the gate. "May I come in?" "You may stand in the garden. The parlor is not ready for visitors." He flushed. He had not flushed since their wedding breakfast, when an aunt had said something unkind about her dress. He tied the horse to the gate-post. She opened the gate. He came in and stopped on the path 2 paces from her, and the 4 days he had spent learning what she had done were in his face, and he did not know how to begin. "I read the ledgers. All of them. All of them. It took you 4 days. It took me 4 days." She nodded. She did not ask which had been the worst. She knew which had been the worst. He went on without being asked. The letters to the parish at Greal, the note on the Latham widow, the pencil in the margin of the rent book about the cooper's wife, the survey, the map above the desk, the drawer with the receipts in your mother's name. "I read it all." "Yes. I did not know any of it." "No. I am sorry." She considered him. He was not a man who said sorry easily. He had not, in 3 years, said it to her once. The word now was offered without ornament, and she received it without ornament, and they stood in her garden in the cold afternoon, and did not speak for some time. "There is a cottage, 2 rooms below, 2 above, It is on the Dowager's land, at her gift. The annuity is settled through Mr. Mostyn. The roof is sound. The orchard has 6 trees that bear well. You will not be hungry. You will not be cold. You will not be among strangers, because the Dowager's people are decent, and her steward is a friend of my father's." He looked at her. He had begun, while she spoke, to understand that the conversation was not the one he had ridden over to have. "You arranged this?" "Some weeks ago." "Before this morning?" "Some weeks ago, Adrian. Before this morning." "You knew I would come to this?" "I knew you would come to something. I did not know the shape of it. I knew the shape of what you would need afterwards. I prepared the shape." He sat down. He sat down on the low stone wall that ran along the path, and he put his face briefly in his hands. And then he took it away again, because he had been brought up not to put his face in his hands, and the habit held. "Why?" "Because you will need it." "That is not what I am asking." "I know." She did not sit beside him. She stood on the path with her hands clasped in front of her apron, and she gave him the answer she had given the Dowager, because it was the only answer she had. "Habit." He looked up. He had heard the word the way the Dowager had heard it. He understood it less well than the Dowager had, but he understood it well enough. "You do not love me." "No, not for some time." "You did once." "For perhaps a month." "I was mistaken." "In what?" "In thinking that your ease was kindness." He took this. He took it without protest, because he had read the ledgers and he could not, any more, protest anything. He looked down at his boots, which were muddy from the lane, and he was silent for a long while. "I do not deserve a cottage from you." "You do not. That is not the point. The cottage is not about deserving. It is about what is to be done with you." "What is to be done with me?" "You are to be housed, fed, kept warm, and left alone to read whatever you choose to read, since reading was the thing you would not do before. You may, if you wish, become useful to the Dowager in some small way. She would not refuse it. She would not flatter you about it either. That, I think, would be good for you." He almost smiled. It was the first time she had seen him almost smile in a year. "You have thought this through." "It is what I do." "Yes, it is what you do. I should have known that. I should have known it the day I married you. I did not know it until Tuesday." "No, Beatrice." "Yes. Was there ever an hour, in 3 years, when I might have come to you, and found you, and not too late?" She considered the question with the seriousness that had been asked. She considered the candle stub at the back of her mind that had gone out 4 days ago in the corridor outside the library. She considered the small, precise hand in which she had signed letters for the Duke of Wexmoor, by his order, and the survey she had drawn by lantern in October, and a look the boot boy had given her on the back stairs. There was an hour. When? Most evenings, between 7 and 8. I was at the desk in the office. The door was open. You walked past it sometimes on the way to the dining room. If you had stopped once, if you had said, "What are you doing?" and waited for the answer, the hour was there for 3 years. He closed his eyes. He did not open them for a long moment. I never stopped. No, I never said, "What are you doing?" No. He opened his eyes. They were wet, but he did not let the wet become anything more than itself. He looked at her standing on the path in her borrowed apron, with her hair loose at the temple, and he saw her, perhaps for the first time, as she was. Not the steward's daughter who had been useful to him, but a woman who had been holding up a house in silence while waiting for him to ask a single question, and who had stopped waiting on a Tuesday morning at 10 o'clock by his own clock, because his clock had been wrong, and she had known it had been wrong, and she had not corrected him because it had not been her place to. I will take the cottage. I thought you would. It is more than I deserve. I told you, deserving is not the point. He stood. He did not approach her. He understood now that approaching her was not a thing he was permitted to do, and he accepted this understanding without protest, because the 4 days had taught him at least the habit of accepting what the ledgers told him. May I write to you? She considered. You may write to me about the south-facing apple at the cottage. It will need rebinding in March. You may write to me about the dowager's rents if she chooses to send you down with a question. You may write to me, in time, about whatever you have read that week. If the reading is honest, I will answer. If it is not honest, I will not. That is fair. It is what is to be done. He stood a moment longer. Then he turned, untied the horse, mounted, and looked down at her once from the saddle. The light was beginning to go. The hedges along the lane had turned the color of pewter, and a thrush, late for the season, was running through a phrase from the orchard. Beatrice. Yes. Thank you for the cottage. You are welcome. He rode away down the stone lane. She watched him to the bend. When he was gone, she went back up the path, knelt again by the south-facing apple, and finished the knot she had begun before he came. Her hands were steady. The cracked seal she had carried in her glove for 4 days, she had, that morning, dropped into the kitchen fire without ceremony. The 2 halves had burned in a single small puff of green flame, the color of old wax, and she had not, while they burned, thought of him at all. The winter that followed was a hard one. The river froze at the lower meadow for the first time in 12 years, and the dowager's steward came down in February to ask Beatrice's advice about the South Beck, and her advice was given and taken. The coal seams released, on terms that did not destroy the tenants, to a Newcastle firm whose principal Beatrice had been in correspondence with for 2 years under her mother's name. The Latham widow kept her cow. The curate at Greele had his disputed glebe restored. The chrysanthemums at Hartcombe, which Mrs. Bream had ordered for a different occasion, were not ordered again the following autumn, because Mrs. Bream had gone to live with her sister in Norwich, and the housekeeper who replaced her preferred plain green. Adrian Thorne moved into the cottage at Stenwick 3 weeks before Christmas. He brought 1 trunk, a writing case, and a small box of books his father had left him, and which he had never opened. He read them. He read them slowly, in the manner of a man teaching himself a hand he should have learned as a boy, and he made notes in the margins in a script that became, over the winter, less ornamental and more like his wife's. He did not write to her in the first month. He wrote to her in the second, about the south-facing apple which had survived the frost. She answered. The letters between them were short and practical, and contained nothing that would have interested a third reader, which was, on both sides, the point. He did not come to Stenwick again that year. He understood that he was not to. In the spring he began, at the dowager's request and the dowager's small, dry insistence, to walk the boundaries of Linen Cross with her steward, and to learn, on foot, the land he had owned all his life and had not, until now, set his hand to. He learned slowly. He learned. By the end of the summer, he could name the tenants at Linen Cross by their cottages, which was a thing he had never been able to do at Hartcombe, and he did not, when he caught himself being pleased about this, pretend the pleasure was anything other than late. Beatrice did not marry. She did not consider it. There was no rival suitor at the assembly rooms because she did not go to the assembly rooms. There was no worthier man in the next county because the next county did not interest her. Her work was the work in front of her, which by the second year had grown to include the management of a small consortium of widows' properties along the river, undertaken at the dowager's instruction and conducted in the parlor at Stinnock, with 2 clerks and a great deal of strong tea. She slept well. She rose early. She walked in the orchard every morning before the post arrived, and she put her hand on each trunk in turn, and the motion of it remained the most familiar thing she did. On the Thursday in the autumn of the second year, the Dowager of Linen Cross died in her chair after dinner, with her spectacles on her nose and a folded copy of Beatrice's spring report on her lap. She had read it twice. The second reading was unfinished. She had marked the place with a sprig of lavender from the jar at her elbow, and she had then, very quietly, gone to sleep. Beatrice came to Linen Cross when she was sent for. She arranged what needed arranging. The Dowager had left the cottage at Stenwick by codicil to Adrian Thorne for his lifetime, and after his lifetime to the parish poor. She had left the bulk of her estate, including the coal-bearing acres at the south back, to a small trust whose 3 trustees were the parish curate at Greal, Mr. Mostyn of Norwich, and Mrs. Vane of Stenwick. The trust was to be administered for the benefit of the tenants of both estates in perpetuity, and the Dowager had added, in her own hand at the foot of the document, a sentence the solicitor read out without comment. And Mrs. Vane will know what is to be done, because she always has. Beatrice received this without remark. She folded the document. She put it in her writing case. She walked back from Linen Cross to Stenwick in the early dark, and she met Adrian Thorne on the lane at the place where the hedge had been laid 2 winters back. He had come up from the cottage to walk in the dusk, because he walked at dusk now, the way the Dowager had taught him. He stopped when he saw her. They stood for a moment on the lane. "You have been to Linen Cross?" "Yes." "Is she gone?" "Yes." He took off his hat. He did not put it back on. He stood with it in his hand, and the wind moved his hair, which was grayer than it had been a year ago. And his face, which had grown thinner, was the face of a man who had at last begun to look at the world he stood in. "She was kind to me. She was honest with you. It is what you needed." "Yes." The thrush that had been running through a phrase from the orchard on the day he had come to Stenwick was, somewhere in the hedge, running through the same phrase again. They both heard it. Neither of them remarked it. "Beatrice." "Yes." "I was a fool." "You were. I am less of one now." "Yes." He looked at her. He did not move toward her. He had not, in 2 years, moved toward her, and he did not move now. The recognition between them was complete and late, and had no use, and they both knew it. The knowledge was the gentlest thing that had passed between them since the day he had married her, and it asked nothing of either of them, because there was, by now, nothing left to ask. "Will you go on at Stenwick?" "I will." "Will you come to the cottage sometimes, to see the south-facing apple?" I will come once a year, in March, to rebind it. That will do. That will do. She went on up the lane. He stood at the place where the hedge had been laid and watched her until the bend. When she was gone, he put his hat back on, and he walked down to the cottage, and he lit the lamp at the deal table, and he opened the book he had been reading, which was a book of his father's about the management of small properties, and he read another page of it, slowly, the way he had taught himself to read, and the room was warm and quiet and entirely sufficient. In her own parlor at Stenwick, half a mile up the lane, Beatrice Vane set the dowager's codicil on the small table by the window, beside the brown teapot and the lamp she had bought in November of the first year. She made tea. She drank it standing at the window, because she had still, 2 years on, not bought a cushion for the deal chair. She watched the last of the light go out of the orchard, and she thought, without sentiment and without sorrow, that the work in front of her had grown again and would need to be done. She set the cup down on the sill. She took up her pen. She began in the small, precise hand that the village had now known for 2 winters as Mrs. Vane's, the first letter of a long evening's correspondence, addressed to a tenant at the upper end of the dowager's land, on the matter of a roof that would not survive another winter without help. There is something about a woman who walks out of a room without raising her voice, and arranges, before she leaves it, that the man who put her out of it will not be cold in the winter, that I find I cannot quite put down. If you would like more stories told at this distance, with this kind of quiet at the center of them, subscribing keeps the next one within reach. See you then.